Ma'am, step back from the bassinets. Don't touch anything.
Officer, what is this? This is a sterile environment. You can't just walk in here with your gear on. These are infants. They're...
Maria Wayne, we've been tracking the logs. We know about the shift gaps.
Maria Wayne, a woman who had walked these linoleum floors for 15 years, stood near the center of the nursery. She was a fixture of the ward, a person whose presence was synonymous with competency and calm. In the initial seconds of the encounter, her posture remained rigid, her expression carefully neutral, a mask of professionalism she had perfected over a decade of high-pressure shifts. Yet as the officer moved past the rows of bassinets and gestured toward the two specific units, the mask faltered. The officer did not need to speak. The pointing of a gloved finger toward the mislabeled ID tags was enough to convey the gravity of the situation. In that singular, frozen moment, the carefully maintained order of Maria's professional life dissolved into an undeniable panic, a split-second shift that would serve as the opening chapter of a catastrophic downfall. It is difficult to reconcile the woman in the frame, caught in the harsh, grainy light of the body cam, with the Maria Wayne that her colleagues described for years. Before the federal indictment and the headlines, Maria was viewed as the bedrock of the unit. She was the nurse who volunteered for the holidays, the one who stayed late to mentor the residents, and the one whose paperwork was consistently cited in administrative reviews as impeccable. There was no history of erratic behavior, no signs of personal instability, and certainly no red flags in her performance evaluations. She was a master of the institution, deeply embedded in its rhythms, which made the reality of what she had been doing under the cover of darkness all the more devastating to those who had once considered her a mentor. To understand how this happened, one must look at the mechanism itself. A neonatal intensive care unit is not built on trust alone. It is a fortress of redundant systems. Every interaction, from the administration of medication to the movement of a patient, requires a protocol, a two-nurse check, a barcode scan, a manual entry into the ledger. These are the rules that guard against human error, the very foundation of neonatal care. Maria Wayne knew these rules better than anyone. She understood the gaps between the protocols, the brief windows of time when a nurse might be distracted or a monitor might be cycling through its calibration. She did not fight the system. She exploited the structural blind spots that everyone else assumed were unbreachable. The undoing of her meticulous facade began with something seemingly trivial, a mother's intuition. When Sarah Jenkins noticed that the ID band on her son's ankle didn't sit with the same tension as it had hours earlier, she mentioned it to the staff. It was, by all medical accounts, a minor discrepancy, quickly dismissed as a common byproduct of a baby's natural swelling or movement. But that singular, ignored observation became the thread that unraveled the entire tapestry. Internal audit teams, acting on a rare surge of caution, began to look closer at the shift logs. They discovered that during the nights when Maria was assigned to the floor, the electronic patient tracking system experienced consistent, one-minute hiccups, tiny, almost invisible gaps in the data that coincided perfectly with the timeframes when infants were being moved for routine care. As the investigation deepened, the pattern grew darker. What initially appeared to be a string of clerical errors revealed itself to be a deliberate, escalating series of actions. The digital forensics team uncovered more than just logs. They found evidence of a calculated experiment. Maria wasn't just swapping Barbies to cause chaos. She was testing the speed and efficiency of the nursing staff, intentionally creating false alarms in distant wings to draw her coworkers away from the nursery. The logbook later discovered in her locker, hidden behind a false panel, contained the chilling reality of her internal world. It was a ledger of lives, filled with precise measurements, birth weights, and coded notes identifying which infants were the targets for her next swap. The evidence was undeniable, and as the investigators pieced together the timeline, the model employee narrative vanished, replaced by the grim portrait of a professional who had turned the sanctuary of the nursery into a theater for her own cold-blooded manipulation. When the authorities finally moved in, they did so with the weight of that evidence behind them. They walked into the nursery at the exact time their surveillance had identified as the peak vulnerability window, finding Maria exactly where she expected to be, doing exactly what she had been doing for months. The arrest was swift, quiet, and profoundly final. As the handcuffs were secured, and the reality of the situation took hold. The panic that had flickered in her eyes at the moment of discovery hardened into a hollow, quiet realization. She was taken out of the ward that had been her professional home, leaving behind a team that was reeling, a hospital that would have to undergo a total systemic overhaul, and the families who would never look at a hospital bracelet the same way again. The subsequent 20-year sentence handed down by the court was not just for the act of swapping infants. It was for the systemic violation of the most fundamental promise of care, a betrayal so deep that it shook the community's faith in the institutions they rely on during their most vulnerable moments. Long before the sterile corridors of St. Jude's Memorial were tainted by the shadow of a criminal investigation, there was only the version of Maria Wayne that everyone knew and everyone trusted. She was, by all accounts, the literal and figurative anchor of the graveyard shift, a veteran presence in a wing defined by its volatility and high-stakes demands. For over a decade, Maria had occupied the quiet, low-light hours of the hospital, moving with a rhythm that felt both practiced and profoundly reassuring. Her colleagues spoke of her with a mix of genuine admiration and reliance. She was the nurse you wanted at your side when a monitor spiked or a newborn's vitals took a turn for the unpredictable. She possessed a rare, soothing bedside manner that seemed to dampen the anxiety of even the most terrified new parents, a skill that transformed her into a cornerstone of the neonatal unit's identity. In the meticulously organized world of the hospital's administrative records, Maria's professional history read like a manual for excellence. Her personnel file was not merely a collection of employment dates and basic data. It was a testament to a career defined by unwavering precision. Year after year, supervisor reviews were punctuated with the highest possible marks, consistently citing her as someone who exceeds expectations in every category of care. Punctuality was her hallmark, and her adherence to the hospital's often exhausting, rigid protocols was legendary among the nursing staff. She never cut corners, at least not in a way that any auditor could see. She was the nurse who double-checked the medication dosages that others might have rushed, the one who ensured the intake forms were filled with a near-obsessive level of detail. It was this very aura of reliability that made her eventual betrayal feel so personal and so utterly catastrophic to those who walked the halls with her. The parents who entrusted her with their infants, the most vulnerable, precious treasures of their lives, felt a sense of security that was built on the foundation of Maria's public persona. They left their children in her care at the end of a long day, confident that they were placing them into the hands of a guardian who embodied the very best of the profession. This deep-seated trust is exactly what made her subsequent descent into manipulation so difficult for the hospital community to process. The fall from grace was not just a headline or a case file. It was a profound disorientation for everyone who had looked at Maria Wayne and seen not a threat, but the safest pair of hands in the ward. To her peers, the discovery of her actions didn't just highlight a flaw in the system. It shattered the illusion that they knew exactly who was standing next to them in the quiet hours of the night. The architecture of a neonatal intensive care unit is constructed upon a bedrock of absolute, uncompromising verification, a silent language of safety designed to eliminate the possibility of error before it can even manifest. Every infant born into that fragile, climate-controlled ecosystem is immediately tethered to their identity through a series of interlocking safeguards. The clinical ID bands locked firmly around ankles and wrists, the specific, non-transferable serial numbers etched onto the bassinets, and the absolute requirement for dual nurse sign-offs before any transfer or medication administration can occur. This is not merely a bureaucratic preference. It is a rigid, fail-safe environment, a masterfully engineered defense against the chaos of a busy hospital floor, specifically architected to render the nightmare of a child being lost or replaced a physical impossibility. At the heart of this intricate web of protocols lies a singular, unwritten assumption that functions as the entire unit's moral backbone, the belief that the person standing in the scrubs, the nurse, the technician, the caregiver, is a silent partner in the preservation of life, whose personal ethics and commitment to the patient's well-being hold absolute precedence over all other considerations. The entire security apparatus is predicated on this trust. It is built to catch clerical mistakes, to flag forgotten tasks, and to alert staff to physical dangers, but it is fundamentally unequipped to monitor for a breach of intent from within the ranks of those entrusted to protect it. Maria Wayne, through her decade of service, had not merely learned these protocols. She had mastered them to such a granular degree that she could see the architecture for what it really was, a system of levers and pulleys. She understood the flow of the unit better than anyone else on the floor, the specific moments when the dual sign-off process became a reflexive habit rather than a vigilant check, the exact intervals during which a bassinet could be moved while the staff's focus was elsewhere, and the subtle ways that bureaucratic oversight could be managed to deflect suspicion. He possessed an intimate, almost structural knowledge of the very safeguards designed to keep her in check, and it was this profound, inside-out understanding that provided her with the terrifying leverage to navigate around them. She did not need to break the system. She only needed to learn the precise, microscopic gaps where the protocol was most vulnerable, transforming the protective mechanisms of the hospital into a screen behind which she could operate with absolute, calculated impunity. The unraveling of Maria Wayne's carefully constructed reality did not begin with a siren or a sudden, dramatic confrontation, but with the quiet, nagging weight of a mother's intuition. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Sarah Jenkins, exhausted and still reeling from the physical and emotional turbulence of birth, reached out to cradle her newborn for a scheduled feeding. As her fingers brushed the infant's ankle, she felt the slight, unsettling slide of the identification band. It was loose, fractionally perhaps, but it felt wrong in a way that defied the rigid standards she had been told to expect. When she brought the discrepancy to the attention of the nursing staff, her concern was met with a practiced, sympathetic smile and the casual assurance that this was nothing more than a common side effect of a newborn's natural fluid fluctuation and physical settling. The staff, busy with the relentless, cyclical demands of the ward, quickly categorized her worry as new mother anxiety, a standard, dismissive label that effectively neutralized the alarm. But for the first time in the history of St. Jude's Memorial, that dismissal did not mark the end of the inquiry. Sarah's observation lingered, a persistent, quiet grain of sand in the gears of the hospital's operation, eventually prompting a low-level review by the internal audit team. What was meant to be a routine check of the logs to reassure a concerned parent soon transformed into something far more clinical and unsettling. The auditors began to systematically cross-reference the granular shift timestamps with the digital nursery access logs, looking for any inconsistency that might explain a loose identification band. It was a tedious, painstaking process of mapping minutes against actions, but beneath the surface of the hospital's operational normalcy, a distinct, damning pattern began to emerge. They discovered that the anomalies were not random, nor were they errors of overworked staff. They were perfectly timed, recurring gaps in the digital record. During every single shift that Maria Wayne was assigned to the floor, the electronic monitoring system, the very digital heartbeat of the nursery, experienced a precisely timed 1-minute blind spot. These were not system glitches or power fluctuations, but clear, deliberate lapses in the data flow. Within that fleeting 60-second window of electronic silence, the hospital's digital eyes were effectively closed, leaving the nursery floor untracked and unverified. It was in these 1-minute intervals, hidden within the monotonous records of a long, quiet shift, that the first threads of Maria's deception were finally pulled, exposing a reality that the hospital had never been built to confront. The revelation of those 1-minute blind spots served as the foundation for a much deeper, more disturbing investigation that quickly spiraled into the realm of the unthinkable. As digital forensics teams delved into the archives of the hospital's security and tracking data, they uncovered a chilling, calculated trajectory of escalation that defied any simple explanation of negligence. It began in the periphery of the ward's daily life with seemingly inconsequential irregularities, unexplained missing baby blankets, small personalized trinkets, and infant caps that would vanish from one bassinet only to reappear, days later, in a completely different corner of the room. At the time, these incidents were treated as minor, annoying clerical oversights, but under the scrutiny of the full-scale investigation, they transformed into clear, deliberate markers of a boundary-pushing process. The progression moved from inanimate objects to the living subjects of the nursery as Maria began to systematically swap identification bands between infants. These were not mistakes, but calculated tests of the ward's operational awareness, specifically designed to monitor how quickly the junior nursing staff would identify and correct a discrepancy in patient documentation. She was essentially utilizing the nursery as a high-stakes laboratory, observing from the shadows to see how her colleagues responded to manufactured confusion. This was a psychological experiment played out on the most vulnerable of patients, with Maria holding all the variables and the rest of the staff unknowingly acting as the subjects. By the final month of her tenure, the scale of her operation had reached a level of terrifying organization that stunned the investigative team. Hidden behind a false panel in her private locker, investigators discovered a worn, meticulously maintained logbook that served as the dark blueprint of her actions. It was not a journal of feelings or grievances, but a cold, clinical record of her switches. Page after page contained precise data points, the exact birth weights of the infants, their precise times of arrival into the nursery, and most damningly specific notations identifying her intended targets for the night. The level of detail was surgical, transforming the human element of the ward into a series of variables to be manipulated for reasons that remained, to the investigators, chillingly opaque. She wasn't merely swapping Barbies. She was orchestrating an elaborate, sustained disruption of life, treating the sacred environment of the neonatal ward as a controlled space for her own unchecked psychological agenda. The existence of that logbook served as the final, absolute piece of evidence, stripping away any remaining defense and proving that the chaos in the nursery was the result of a mind that had long since detached itself from the moral and ethical responsibilities of her role. The turning point in the hunt for the truth emerged not from a single confession, but from a painstaking synchronization of data that finally pulled back the curtain on Maria Wayne's methodology. A lead detective, tasked with reviewing the exhaustive archives of the hospital's security infrastructure, identified a peculiar, rhythmic anomaly embedded within the CCTV feeds. By meticulously layering the surveillance footage over the unit's activity logs, a clear predatory pattern was unveiled. Every time a swap was initiated, there was a corresponding, intentional disturbance in a distant wing of the hospital. Maria had been masterfully triggering false alarms, faking medical emergencies or equipment failures, to systematically draw the nursing staff away from the nursery, creating the very blind spots that allowed her to act without observation. This discovery transformed the investigation from a series of disparate, confusing incidents into a cohesive, deliberate narrative of deception. The detectives, anchored by the critical visual evidence captured in the footage, began to weave together months of fragmented footage and conflicting digital logs. Each timestamp on a video frame was cross-referenced against the internal digital records, mapping the nurse's movements with a precision that left no room for coincidence. It became undeniably clear that these were not merely accidental clerical errors or the result of a tired, overworked staff struggling under the pressure of a high-volume unit. They were, in every instance, calculated acts of intentional manipulation. As the timeline solidified, the evidence painted a chilling portrait of a professional who had inverted the purpose of her own security protocols to facilitate her crimes. The footage, combined with the forensic data, provided an unshakable case that highlighted how deeply the deception had been woven into the daily life of the ward. By the time the investigation reached its conclusion, the authorities had successfully dismantled the facade of the model employee, replacing it with a concrete, evidence-backed narrative that exposed the deliberate nature of her actions. What had begun as an investigation into a simple, nagging concern from a new mother had, through persistence and data-driven rigor, evolved into a comprehensive dismantling of a crime that had, for too long, hidden in plain sight. The final act of this calculated deception did not play out in an interrogation room or a courthouse, but within the very space where the violations had occurred. The confrontation happened precisely where the crime had lived, breathing in the same recirculated air and standing under the same harsh, sterile lights. At exactly 03:17 a.m., a timestamp that served as the grim, documented culmination of the evidence captured in the footage law enforcement descended upon the neonatal ward. The timing was not a coincidence. It was a deliberate synchronization, a closing of the loop that had been open for far too long. As the officers crossed the threshold into the nursery, the atmosphere shifted instantly from the quiet, monitored routine of the graveyard shift to the sharp, irrevocable reality of a police operation. Maria Wayne, the nurse who had once navigated these surroundings with the practiced ease of an anchor, stopped in her tracks. There was no attempt to flee, no desperate scramble for an exit, and perhaps most hauntingly, no final, frantic plea of innocence or excuse. She simply stood still, her form bathed in the unforgiving glare of the ward's lights, her posture sagging ever so slightly as the weight of the investigation, and the reality of what she had dismantled, finally and fully, settled upon her. The silence in the room was absolute as the officers moved toward her, the tension of the preceding months collapsing into a single defining moment. As the metal handcuffs clicked into place, the sound echoed sharply against the quiet monitors of the nursery, a jarring metallic note that signaled the definitive end of her long, unblemished career and the immediate forfeiture of her freedom. In that moment of surrender, the facade that had protected her for 15 years dissolved completely, leaving behind only the stark, undeniable truth of her actions. The ward, a place meant for the most fragile of beginnings, had become the site of her final, professional end, marking the transition from a trusted caregiver to a subject of the very system she had so systematically betrayed. The judicial system did not hold back when the case finally reached the bench, meeting the gravity of the offenses with a sentence that echoed the profound nature of the betrayal. In the final sentencing hearing, the judge delivered a stern rebuke of Maria Wayne's actions, specifically highlighting the unparalleled breach of public trust that sat at the core of her crimes. With the gavel strike, she was handed a 20-year term in federal prison, a period of confinement meant to reflect the magnitude of the lives she had disrupted and the sanctity she had violated. For the affected families, among them the Jenkins, the sentencing offered a measure of closure, yet it could not erase the emotional toll that had already been etched into their lives as a permanent, indelible scar. Justice had been formally served, but in the wake of such a calculated deception, the case left behind a haunting, lingering question that resonated far beyond the walls of the courtroom. How does a community begin the arduous, fragile process of regaining trust in a system designed for protection, once that foundational trust has been so thoroughly and deliberately shattered? If you found this investigative breakdown gripping, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. We go deep into the world's most shocking cases, breaking them down every single week. What would you do if you ever realized your own child had been swapped while under the care of those meant to protect them? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.